Again, thank you for being here for this, I think, really interesting set of people, really interesting set and quite diverse set of presentations, broadly around speculative fiction and dystopias, utopias, and what they may or may not tell us about contemporary and future political economy. So making links between fiction of various kinds and our understandings of the contemporary and future world. My name is Chris Huggins. I'm a member of IPEN, the International Political Economy Network, which is both based here at uOttawa and also has representation at Carleton. So I'm not going to take too much time, but I'm briefly going to mention IPEN. I'm going to explain the background to this event, and then I'm going to introduce our speakers before they get started. So IPEN, as I mentioned, is a network obviously looking at international political economy. It's part of CIPS, the Center for International Policy Studies here at uOttawa. Indeed, the presentations today are being recorded and they'll go on the CIPS YouTube channel. So if you have to slip out early, I'm guaranteed you won't fall asleep. But if for any other reason you want to see the presentations again, they should be available on the CIPS YouTube channel in the near future. So IPEN puts on regular events, and right now we have a graduate student essay contest kind of underway as well. So we put on regular events and other kinds of activities around political economy. I do want to make an announcement for an upcoming event organized by IPEN. So on February 25th, right here in this room at 2:30, we have a scholar, Zhao Jun Li, presenting his book, How China Sees the World, Insights from China's International Relations Scholars, which seeks to make sense of how Chinese leaders perceive China's rise in the world, especially through international relations theory. So that's coming up quite soon, so put that in your calendars. So why are we talking about speculative fiction? First of all, what is speculative fiction? I'm sure our presenters are going to talk about this a little bit more, and I'm sure you have your own ideas. Speculative fiction is a very broad term. It's been used for quite a long time by many different people. It includes science fiction, fantasy, utopian fiction, post-apocalyptic fiction, and quite often it's preferred by authors like Margaret Atwood to these more pigeonholed kind of categories, because it's a very open way of looking at literature and looking at the world. So this is what we're discussing today, various different forms of literature and fiction, and maybe TV and movie versions as well. Why are we talking about fiction when sometimes the world of international political economy tends to be more realist, tends to be more hard-nosed, takes itself sometimes very seriously. I mean, I'm speaking personally here, but for me, fiction is important for a number of reasons. And I think all of us, no matter how busy we are, like to keep a book by our nightstand or to watch something now and again. So first of all, I think for those of us who are dealing in the kind of policy world or the academic world, the language that we use can sometimes become dry, jargony, lots of acronyms. I work in international development, the School of International Development and Global Studies. So I think fiction can give us a much richer vocabulary, a different way of talking about the world, which we can then use in our work as well as in our everyday lives. It can open up the ways in which we speak and see the world. I think another big benefit of engaging with fiction and enjoying fiction is its focus on emotion, on feelings, on the human scale of things, which again can be missing sometimes in our, again, hard-nosed kind of policy and political analysis. The world of affect, right, as we talk about it in academia. That's something which is easily overlooked. And just to pick on a couple of examples, I'm going to try and resist the temptation to name check all of my favorite authors and TV shows and movies and everything else. But someone like Arundhati Roy, I think really encapsulates, someone who has worked, through The God of Small Things and her other novel, She has written incredible scenes, really kind of got people interested in issues, but also has worked as an activist. She works in development, in the field, as well as writing about it, conceiving it. So I think she kind of encapsulates the very real links between fiction and real-world activism and engagement in very political issues. And there are various examples we can give of fiction allowing us to imagine a future, sometimes a better future, sometimes a worse future. I won't go through a long list, but to cite someone who's based here in Canada, William Gibson, seen as the kind of godfather of the idea of cyberspace, the iconography of late capitalism, really giving us the tools to think through the kind of social, technological world in which we live today. So I can give many other examples, but I'll leave it there for that. I work on, like I said, international development. And just to highlight one other kind of real benefit, I think, of dealing with fiction from the world in which I work, climate fiction, or cli-fi, is an increasingly influential, and I think a few presenters today are going to talk about examples of cli-fi, looking at climate change, and looking at the real risks that humanity faces. I think it can be a very scary vision to look at, but obviously, Margaret Atwood has done this in various novels. There's other examples I could give as well. But I think, again, when we're looking at something as big as climate change, as terrifying as climate change and the impacts around the world, looking at it through the lens of writing or of a good TV show or a good movie can allow us to focus on the human element, can allow us to focus on the individual, and allow us to avoid the kind of paralysis and fear that can sometimes be generated by the sheer scope and scale of what we're dealing with. So that's just one of many examples, and as I say, I'm reining myself in and stopping myself from talking about all my favorite novels and books and TV shows. So I'm going to move on to introducing our panelists. I'm going to introduce them all in detail to start with, and then we'll go from one to another in this order. So Robert Barsky is right here, is Canada Research Chair in Law, Narrative and Border Crossing in the Department of Law and Legal Studies at Carleton University. Formerly a professor at the School of Law at Vanderbilt University. He's an expert on Noam Chomsky, literary theory, convention refugees, immigration and refugee law, borders, work through the Americas and Montreal. He has written 2 books on the work of Noam Chomsky. His most recent books are Undocumented Immigrants in an Era of Arbitrary Law and Hatched, which is a novel. So Professor Barsky is on both sides of the fence here as both an academic and a novelist. He's been involved with and in fact founded a number of literary and other journals. He's been a visiting professor at Yale and had many other very interesting appointments as well to VU Amsterdam, the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the University of Edinburgh, and I could go on. Ummni Khan, in the middle here, holds an SJD in Law from the University of Toronto, and is an associate professor at Carleton University in the Department of Law and Legal Studies. Her research focuses on the socio-legal construction of stigmatized sexual practices, as well as many other gender and race dimensions. Her book, Vicarious Kinks, Sadomasochism in the Socio-Legal Imaginary, from 2014, examines the ways a criminal regulation of consensual SM rests on problematic ideological claims that engage with psychiatry, anti-SM feminism and film. She's also, of course, published numerous academic journal articles, book chapters and blogs, which you can track down. A recent Shirk-funded project addressed the regulation of sex trade clients. In 2016, she was awarded the Faculty of Public Affairs Research Excellence Award, and she is the former Joint Chair in Women's Studies at Carleton University and the University of Ottawa. Last but by no means least, and we're going in alphabetical order here, Nisa Mali is a Senior Policy Analyst with the Brookfield Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship at Ryerson University, where she leads research at the intersection of technology, labor, economic growth, and inequality. She brings a social policy and social services lens to the Institute, having worked on employment and training, poverty reduction, and other issues for federal and municipal governments and the non-profit sector. She holds an MA in Public and International Affairs from University of Ottawa, right here, researching open government and digital citizen engagement, and has a BFA in writing from the University of Victoria, so again, working both sides of the fence here. So welcome to you all, thank you so much. And we're going to start with Professor Barsky.
So first of all, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure and honor. We just arrived here from the States, so this is one of the first times I've had occasion to meet with you all, and I hope it's not by any means the last. It's a wonderful occasion for me also. It just happens that today we're signing an agreement with MIT Press to start a new journal that connects art and the humanities policy. So using art and humanities to advance issues of policy. So the entire approach of this conference is something that is very near and dear to my heart. I'm going to be a little bit more formal than I would normally like to be, simply because I have too many good stories for you and I would have kept you here for way too long. So I'm going to read from the beginning of a book that I hope to send next week, which treats the question of rereading the corpus of great literature, imagining that major characters are suffering the plight that is similar to convention refugees. The example I'm going to use is Frankenstein, but the book itself begins with Homer and goes all the way up to Alice in Wonderland, so we can chat about these things. The great books reside at the very heart of Western civilization, providing a means of escaping our own reality by offering compelling stories that resonate far beyond the era from which they come. These works stimulate readers to think about the characters, stories, and questions that they contain, and their pervasiveness and influence sometimes leads us to apply the resulting insights to current policy concerns. Perhaps this is why the corpus of great books persists, even beyond liberal arts colleges, which derive a portion of their legitimacy from their mission of purveying time-tested knowledge from arcane sources. In fact, this corpus, variously described and cataloged, has been a touchstone for so many writers, artists, and philosophers that most people agree upon its continued relevance, even if they challenge the coveted space that it occupies within some versions of the Academy. The very invocation of Homer's Odyssey, Dante's Divine Comedy, Shelley's Frankenstein, Richard Wright's Native Son, or Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird creates a sense of shared experience, a reference that is deemed, often without much discussion, to be meaningful, even if the text to which their name refers remains, for the vast majority of the population, unread. There are also institutions such as Walt Disney, Nintendo, and places such as Las Vegas or Dubai or Disney World that purposely invoke characters from the canon. Apollo, Aladdin, the Pied Piper, Pinocchio, Jean Valjean, and Cinderella are all well known, although those who are curious enough to track down, say, Victor Hugo's 1862 novel Les Miserables, are generally surprised by the vast distance between the real characters and their popular namesakes. All of this suggests that texts from the canon remain important, even amongst naysayers, not only because they offer readers the opportunity to join a rough and tumble group of pirates searching for Treasure Island, but also because their very weight and prestige bolster the legitimacy of Western society by anchoring its customs in a long and prestigious trajectory. Even if the humanities sometimes seem to be on life support, and even if it's harder and harder to find even a small number of books that most people have read, there's nevertheless a group of texts that is generally considered both enjoyable and valuable. This value can also be negative, a kind of dead white men corpus that stands in the way of thinking differently about the world. But no matter how justifiable it is to challenge the prestige that they enjoy, or the ways in which they can become tools of discrimination, they do continue to provide pleasure, carry weight, create insight, and situate current practices within some version of deep time. But I don't wish to take up the fraught question of which books should or should not be included in the great curriculum today. Instead, I want to suggest that a significant portion of stories that are deemed to have enduring value in the Western tradition provide insights to current discussions relating to vulnerable migrants' efforts to escape from untenable or undesirable situations in their home countries. We enjoy reading these texts because they offer us a means of escaping our own realities. But it turns out to be the case as well that many of these books that provide us with the means for this escape are themselves narratives about escape. I have thus selected scenes from Frankenstein for today's talk, although I'm happy to talk about everything from Homer to Alice in Wonderland and beyond, in order to reacquaint us with characters who are fleeing in search of protection or a better state, or maybe a better state of mind. There's no lack of narratives about refugees, undocumented migrants, and other vulnerable people trying to cross borders to find protection from harm or destitution. So what is the value of comparing their plight to well-known characters from, say, Frankenstein? One reason for setting out such comparisons is that people are more likely to pay attention to narratives of persons with whom they have a relationship. My own research on refugees and undocumented migrants has often involved interviews with people who claim to favor draconian restrictions against foreigners that somehow excludes people that they themselves know. So the story goes something like, I support strong measures against illegals, although my nanny slash gardener slash housekeeper deserves special consideration because he, she is so incredible slash resourceful slash honest slash deserving slash my employee. Narratives humanize characters in contrast to news stories which often relegate outsiders to anonymity, referring to them as parts of, say, a wave or a flow or an influx that has swarmed or overwhelmed, for example, our borders. Great literature also can force us to pay attention to the little details, events, or anecdotes that actually constitutes a life, rather than transforming human experience into relevant details, which undermines the complexity of people's stories. The underscoring of experience is, in part, an act of recognition that is so often downplayed in, for example, legal settings, including, for example, law school education and the courts. Recovering the person behind the testimony is part of legal feminist scholarship that over the years has made huge contributions by focusing upon, for example, caring, I'm thinking here of Robin West, recognition or proximity. A key issue for feminist law, a key issue for feminism in general, and for feminist revision of law work in particular, is the notion of proximity. The idea of understanding the closeness of intellectual discussion to the experiences of daily life. Viewed from this perspective, the great books helps us to take on and understand the world very differently. And while I'm not suggesting that texts as different as Homer's Odyssey or Mary Shelley's Frankenstein were written with related ideas of migrants or migration, I do think that the eternally significant themes that they invoke help us to understand the process of border crossing with more depth, and that reading these books might well induce a greater degree of empathy for the plight of vulnerable migrants. Although they weren't in the immediate danger that faced Byron, it's quite possible to envision that Mary Wollstonecraft and Percy Shelley considered themselves to be refugees in the way that we use the term today. Mary, as you recall, was born to two well-known contemporary dissenters, William Godwin, a modern proponent of anarchism, and Mary Wollstonecraft, the author of A Vindication of the Rights of Women and The Wrongs of Women, or Maria, which Kristen Carlson has called an outlaw novel. And Shelley himself, Percy, was not just a non-believer, he was aggressively atheist. So much so that as we learned from the Hotel de Ville de Londres in Chamonix, that he described himself, rather than just writing his name, he described himself as, quote, an atheist, a lover of humanity, and a Democrat, as you can imagine, a major intellectual discovery. To add another displacement theme to Frankenstein, I'd add that the summer of 1816 was witness to dramatic climate change on account of the 1815 eruption of Indonesia's Mount Tambora, which blasted 12 cubic miles of gas, dust, and rocks into the atmosphere and onto the island of Samoa and the surrounding area. A year later, starving skeletal climate refugees in the tens of thousands roamed the highways of Europe, and landlocked Alpine Switzerland was the worst hit region in all of Europe, producing scenes of social ecological breakdown rarely witnessed since the hellscape of the Black Death. Eyewitness accounts frequently refer to how hunger and persecution turned men and women into beasts, how fear of famine and disease-carrying refugees drove middle-class citizens to demonize these suffering masses as subhuman parasites and turn them away in horror and in disgust. In Byron in Geneva, that summer of 1816, David Ellis describes the amazing activities that took place here inside the Villa Diodati, which Byron had rented and to which he had invited Percy Shelley, Mary Godwin, well, Mary, the daughter of Godwin, Claire Claremont, and John Polidori. A memorably stormy evening led them to the famous game of storytelling, out of which emerged Polidori's Vampire and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Not surprisingly, Frankenstein is filled with descriptions of inhospitable spaces gazed upon by desperate characters in search of protection or solace. In chapter 12, Dr. Frankenstein himself is seeking respite from Geneva that had been rendered oppressive by the effects of his own experiments. The novel describes him standing, quote, beside the sources of the Aveyron, which takes their rise in a glacier that with the slow pace is advancing down the summit of the hills to barricade the valley. And for those of you who have ever read, for example, Shelley's Mont Blanc, you have that impression that that glacier that hovers across Chamonix is going to come down and crush the valley, which, as it turned out 30 years later, it did. Okay, this is the kind of tourism picture that I just love. This is the era of Mel de Glace. The image that Frankenstein refers to is more really the one on the left. I want to show you this one also, since it was an era when people like Percy and Mary were traveling and looking at this Mel de Glace. Dr. Frankenstein, in his travels along the Mel de Glace, looks up and notes that, quote, the abrupt side of the vast mountains were before me. The icy wall of the glacier overhung me. A few shattered pines were scattered around, and the solemn silence of this glorious presence chamber of imperial nature was broken only by the brawling waves or the fall of some vast fragment, the thunder sound of the avalanche, or the cracking reverberation along the mountains of the accumulated ice, which through the silent working of immutable laws was ever and anon rent and torn as if it had been but a plaything in their hands. So that's the description of Dr. Frankenstein. I should just quickly do a climate change thing and show you the picture I took last year of this area. That's the same place. Dr. Frankenstein is drawn to this forsaken land as well as in order to find inspiration, which he documents in the journal that he keeps all the way along through the novel. He, as I'm describing him, is a refugee of his family, his friends, and his colleagues. And he sets out in search of new stories that will help redefine his relationship to society. In so doing, he, like other refugees, finds himself demonized and feared, an outsider to his familiar home. Amidst this flight, he encounters his own creature, the very image of a demonized outsider who finds the entire world both foreign and incommodious. He has taken refuge in a place akin to the Mel de Glace, and now on this forbidden landscape, he confronts his maker and tells him the story of his flight. Remarkably enough, the monster is able to represent himself in language, which he employs to recount his travels. All alone in this forsaken land, he had spotted a cottage, which, as it turns out, was inhabited by a group of refugees who had fled and to which he had not introduced himself until he could find a medium of communication. Quote, I easily perceived that although I eagerly longed to discover myself to these cottagers, I ought not to make the attempt until I had become master of their language, which knowledge might enable me to make them overlook the deformity of my figure. For this, also the contrast perpetually presented to my eyes has made me thus acquainted. Now, in possession of the knowledge of language, which, by the way, the creature learns by reading works from the great canon, including Milton's Paradise Lost, one of these coincidences that I absolutely adore. In possession of the language, the knowledge of language, the creature is also able to learn about the past life of this refugee family and learn the reason for their having fled from their homeland to seek refuge. He also learns that knowledge is not only power, it's also a source of misery. Because through the text that he's read, he learns the impossibility of being integrated into a host society, or indeed into any society. Quote, my person was hideous, my stature gigantic. What does this mean? Who am I? Who was I? Whence did I come? What's my destination? These questions continually recurred to my mind, but I was unable to solve them. Finally, the creature learns of his own creation, thanks to papers that have been written by Dr. Frankenstein himself. And reading them, the creature becomes aware of everything that led to his accursed origin, laid bare in language that described the creature's own anguish at the disgusting circumstances that had produced it. One day, when the blind Dr. DeLacy, the grandfather of this family, this refugee family, as you recall, the creature went to seek guidance about his dreadful plight. Quote, I'm an unfortunate and deserted creature, he says. I look around and I have no relation nor friend upon this earth. These amiable people to whom I go have never seen me and know little of me. I'm full of fear, for if I fail there, I'm an outcast in this world forever. So I'm seeing him as a migrant that is that fears his failure and that is deemed to be different from potential friends in the host state. And he articulates this even despite his goodwill to integrate into society. Quote, these people are kind, says the creature. They're the most excellent creatures in the world, but unfortunately they're prejudiced against me. I have a good disposition. My life has hitherto been harmless and in some degree beneficial. But a fatal prejudice clouds their eyes, and where they ought to see a feeling and kind friend, they behold instead a detestable monster. DeLacy, who's blind to the monster's terrifying aspect, is sympathetic. But suddenly, quote, the cottage door was opened, and in came Felix, Safi, and Agatha. Who can describe their horror and consternation on beholding me? Agatha fainted. Safi, unable to attend to her friend, rushed out of the cottage. Felix darted forward, and with supernatural force tore me from his father, to whose knees I had clung in a transport of fury, and he dashed me to the ground and struck me violently with his stick. I could have torn him limb from limb as the lion rends the antelope, but my heart sank within me as with bitter sickness, and I refrained. I saw him on the point of repeating his blow, and then, overcome by pain and anguish, I instead quitted the cottage, and in the general tumult, I escaped unperceived to my hovel. It's my sense that there's so much in this scene that summons and mirrors the challenges of vulnerable migrants. This family itself is displaced and suffering, and the creature, in his desire to find some kind of solace in a hostile state, has appealed to them. When they turn on him, his benevolence is transformed into fear, and then anger, and finally withdrawal. It is my sense that by demonizing the other, as we're seeing, for example, in the treatment of Muslims in the US, governments risk creating the same reaction, leading not to positive integration, but willful resistance to authority. The creature himself recalls Satan's and Moloch's views of how the dark angels should act in hell in the scene from Milton's Paradise Lost. in which Moloch says, "My sentence after what God has done is for open war. Let us choose, armed with hell flames and fury all at once, or heaven's high towers to force a resistless way." The creature cites this, and he himself has the same sentiments and similar ideas about his plight in regards to others when he says to Dr. Frankenstein that, quote, "All save I were at rest or in enjoyment. I, like the arch-fiend, bore a hell within me, and finding myself unsympathized with, wished to tear up the trees, wreak havoc and destruction around me, and then to have sat down and enjoyed the ruin." Can we learn from Milton? Or can we learn from Shelley about the stories that can save the most vulnerable from demonization and alienation in the host society? The contemporary images of Frontex officers approaching boats adrift in the Mediterranean are not only remarkable for the contrast between the modern warships and the hopelessly overladen, unseaworthy crafts, but also between the parched or starving African refugees and the men equipped with frightening-looking hazmat suits. How do these host country officials appear to someone who has fled violence in South Sudan or Eritrea or Syria, there in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea? What does the refugee experience as he or she places his life into the hands of these strangely clad officers? And what do these officers see as they confront the starving, the destitute, but also the amazing, the talented, and the brilliant people who have exercised their internationally recognized right to test the borders of possible host country in search of protection? Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be part of this conversation. There are going to be some overlaps, actually, with your presentation, but it's going to be more the shadow side of empathy, why we might trouble certain kinds of identifications and certain kinds of empathy impulses when we look at dystopias. And so I would like to talk to you about feminist fiction. I want to focus on The Handmaid's Tale. Really, I'm going to focus on the television show, but I'm going to reference a few more as well. And I'm thinking about these feminist fictions as stages for sexual contestations, negotiations, and pleasures. But I'll begin with content information. I will be talking about sexual violence, and I'll be showing some images from the TV shows that people might find disturbing that reference sexual violence. So, okay. But now I want to start with a provocation, which is to tell you about a scandal that happened in 2018 where a lingerie company launched a new color for their washable silk lingerie, and they called it Offred, which is named after the forced name given to the heroine in The Handmaid's Tale. And it's named after the kind of red of her, of the outfit she has to wear. So they launched this new color, they called it Offred, they thought it was going to be empowering, kind of sexy and cool, and they got very, very criticized. And then they pulled it. So a few months later, another company created the sexy Handmaid's Tale Halloween outfit, and again, within a few hours from people finding out about it, it was severely criticized, it was called out, there was a lot of outrage about it, and so they also pulled it. So my provocation to you is that I actually want to defend the outfit. To me, one of the things I'm trying to convey to you is that I actually think the outfit is pretty reasonable. And part of my argument is that the sexy outfit in some ways is a more honest and a more explicit expression of the erotic fantasy that is being sold by the show. And that part of the reaction to it is a disavowal of the eroticism of the show. Okay, so let me now just back up and tell you what I'm hoping to accomplish. We're going to think through The Handmaid's Tale along with a couple of other texts as a form of sexual political theorization, and that's the more kind of on-the-nose thinking through dystopias and utopias as kind of theorizing what society can be or what it shouldn't be. They're also a site of debates within feminism, and specifically around sexuality, and I think it's one of the things that doesn't get recognized. We sort of think of these feminist fictions as, women against the patriarchy, but actually there are a lot about debates within different kinds of feminists and different kinds of groups of women. Kind of the thing, the sort of thrust of the argument is going to be trying to think through feminist dystopias as overlapping with what I call the moral, political, and entertainment economies of activist, academic, and journalist engagement with the issue of sexual slavery or trafficking. I'm going to say that there's a problematic overlap there. And in particular, I'm going to end by pulling out one of the most problematic aspects are the pleasures of whiteness, sort of unstated whiteness, as both hero and victim. One of the things I want to touch on right now with you. So, okay, here we go. So, just in case you don't know the show, some people, haven't read the novel or seen the show, very quickly I'll just say, Handmaid's Tale is a novel that was adapted into a TV show by Hulu a few years ago. It's about the near future. There's been an ecological disaster. As a result, there's mass sterility, there's a low birth rate, and that sets the stage that allows for a violent patriarchal coup, where part of the U.S. gets to be established as the Republic of Gilead, a patriarchal theocracy with very rigid gender roles, very violent. And one of the key aspects is that fertile women are forced into serving as handmaids to elite families where the wives are ostensibly unable to bear children. And so as these sort of fertile women, there's a small minority of them, they have to undergo having sexual intercourse with the husband while they're ovulating, and then if they get pregnant, they have to hold the pregnancy to term, and then they have to hand over the baby, if it's born healthy, to the family. Then they go on to serve another elite family. So there's an idea, one, that there's a kind of sexual slavery involved in forced sexual intercourse, and then a forced gestational surrogacy. So it touches on some kind of issues in our world right now. Okay, there's two other texts I wanted to reference in this talk. One is a feminist utopian novel called Herland from Charlotte Perkins Gilman, well known for writing the short story The Yellow Wallpaper. So in Herland, which is ostensibly a utopian society, it's an all-female society. They've achieved basically perfect harmony and health. It's based on a pragmatic and utilitarian philosophy centered on motherhood. Everything is about kind of the sacredness of motherhood. Now, incidentally, there's no sex because they've achieved parthenogenesis until these male explorers show up, and the tale is told through the perspective of one of these male explorers. And even then, when the men show up, they all kind of couple up into these monogamous pairs. But in the end, the conclusion, the moral of the story is that the sex that they have should only be done for reproduction. So, and the male narrator agrees with that in the end. He's like, yes, that's right. There are other ways to feel close. We should only have sex for reproduction. So that's the Herland vision of utopia. The other text I want to reference is a short story by Patrick Califia called The Hustler. So The Hustler is a part of an erotic anthology, so its very purpose is to arouse you. That's what each of the stories are there for, among other things. In this dystopia, we have had a radical feminist revolution, but under the radical feminist perspective, they passed these laws where witches and femmes, sex workers, and BDSMers are considered deviants. They're criminalized because their desires or their actions or their presentations are considered regressive misogyny, internalized misogyny. So the erotic tension of the story comes from, and the pleasure, I really think, comes from the transgressing the feminist prohibition of bad patriarchal sex. That's what makes the story sexy, is to create this kind of figure, this radical feminist figure, as a person saying no, and then transgressing that law. Okay, so those are the texts I'm going to talk a little bit about, but mostly we're going to focus on The Handmaid's Tale and the TV show. Okay, so thinking through the shows as dystopias, as in the genre of dystopias. So people, when we talk about dystopias, people often think of them as cautionary tales of the future. And there are a lot of people who think about Handmaid's Tale as that, specifically the television show most recently. And so, you know, it's a warning about climate change. Oh, it's a warning about the Trump era. Oh, it's a warning. It's a warning to conservative women. This is what you're gonna. This is your policy that's gonna lead to this. So that's one way that's one frame that people have read it. Dystopias are also seen as giving you a slightly, not that it's the near future, but actually it's the now. Dystopias are showing us the present day now. And a lot of people have talked about Handmaid's Tale like that as well. We don't have to imagine the worst because women are already in deep, serious trouble. Says Jessica Valenti, The Handmaid's Tale's true success is holding up a mirror to the horrors we've already become so immune to. Other people have used The Handmaid's Tale to advance their particular sexual politics. And so here's an article where someone who's anti-sex work sees The Handmaid's Tale as dramatizing what is a legalized prostitution scheme. So basically saying that women who work as sex workers in a legal regime are actually being coerced. We just don't see their coercion, much like in The Handmaid's Tale. Other people have thought through The Handmaid's Tale as reflecting on surrogacies that happen in the global south, and so saying, okay, it's not happening for white Western women, but it is happening right now, so it's not a dystopia, it's actually reflecting what's happening now, but to women in the global south who are carrying children for women in the global north. Okay, so those are kind of some of the lenses that people have read The Handmaid's Tale through. If we think about utopias, because part of what I want to put to you is a consideration that the slippage between dystopia and utopia is not strict, that there's a blurring between them. But when we think about utopia, people talk often about it as being a form of political theory, a possibility as prescriptive. We should follow whatever the utopia has shown can lead to a more perfect society, or as praxis. So if we go to Herland, which ostensibly, like I said, is a utopia, we see what makes this perfect society: androgyny, cooperation, maternalism, efficiency, eugenics, because it's a big part of actually what that novel's about, and sexual minimalism. So there's that prescription of a better society. Interestingly, Handmaid's Tale also shows a utopia, which is Canada. In the context of the show, Canada kind of gets set up and juxtaposed to Gilead as this place that, where you can seek asylum, where they give you health care, where people, there's freedom, where women can do, make genuine choices. And so there's this interesting way that in order to construct this dystopia, there's a kind of idealization of the myth of, of the myth of Canada as this kind of perfect utopia. Okay, so then the other way that Handmaid's Tale is seen as a utopia, which I think is really funny, and will lead us into thinking through the debates about sexuality with feminists, is this article that came out in 2008 on, it's specifically on street harassment and women's objectification. But the article begins by citing The Handmaid's Tale, the novel, and saying, in this novel, women live in a society where they are highly protected from men and the male gaze. Although they suffer other hellish forms of repression, they nonetheless enjoy the luxury of no longer being leered at by strangers. And then it goes on to just talk about, street harassment. That's the only real reference to The Handmaid's Tale. So, to me, incredibly, this novel about, murder and repression and rape and on, still she finds this sort of sliver of utopian, envisioning, which is that you're not being leered at by men. So to me, that's fascinating, and reflects a particular kind of. I think it reflects the contestation within feminism around what's empowering and what's objectifying. So we can see that there's a kind of blurring between the utopian and the dystopian thinking. Okay, so just putting it out there. Some of the ways that I see all of these texts that I talked about as providing a stage for contestation. So Handmaid's Tale clearly is a stage for people to talk about sex work, to talk about sex trafficking, to talk about gestational surrogacy, pornography, sexual objectification as inherently problematic or degrading or not. So within the story and within the novel as well, we see women saying, like, this is actually liberating. I'm finally being liberated from having to, engage in self-objectification, just like the article on street harassment has said. So and then there are obviously the other women who contest that. So there's an interesting way that we have different feminist perspectives and different kind of female perspectives on the new order. In her land, it's mostly everyone's like fine, everyone's getting along, all the women love each other, except there's this one female character, Alma, who exhibits, according to the narrator, atavistic, coy, feminine tendencies. And so she, I think, implicitly in the novel, is partly made responsible for an attempted sexual assault that happens at the end. And in part, it's because she's still a little too feminine. So that way, the utopian novel is still saying, like, there's still some problem with certain kinds of women and their behavior. And Alma is basically, it's suggested that people like Alma shouldn't have children because they'll pass on their feminine tendencies. And finally, The Hustler is clearly about debates about feminism because the eroticism itself is built on the sex wars between radical feminists and sex-positive feminists and BDSMers. All right. So bearing that kind of debate in mind, I want to end by thinking through The Handmaid's Tale as, because I'm taking a side in sort of the sexual politics of the show. I want to think through The Handmaid's Tale as a white savior / white slavery narrative. So, white slavery, the white slavery panic, the historical white slavery panic centered on this notion of white females being tricked, lured, or forced into prostitution, crossing literal or figurative borders. And there's been a lot of theorization of what it meant and why did it happen, why did we have this sort of white slave panic, and people talk about it reflecting anxieties around sexuality, changing notions around sexuality, gender, class, permeable national borders, and anxieties around capitalism. And so the sort of projected white slavery moral panic happened. And so we see, I think, here in The Handmaid's Tale, another representation of a white slavery image, right? We see offered a white woman who is centered as the kind of sexual slave of the narrative. Alongside kind of white slavery narratives are white rescue narratives, specifically in anti-trafficking discourse. So today we have people very concerned about sex trafficking, but we also have people critiquing that critique of sex trafficking and showing that in some ways some of parts of the anti-trafficking movement is based on a white savior complex. And so we can think of it as the white woman's burden, the white savior industrial complex, or Jasper Parr's reinvocation of Spivak's notion, white women saving brown women from brown men. And again, what's kind of driving it, anxiety, panic, guilt about global capitalism, but also such a narrative centered women from the global north, white women as civilized, liberal, enlightened, self-respecting, humanitarian feminist heroes. Okay, so there's so much in this TV show that centers June as a savior, both visually, but also in her actions. She's constantly saving other women. She's the one leading the resistance. So here she's the first person to stand up to Aunt Lydia, and these men who are pointing guns at her, and then she leads other people to join her in that resistance. And in the world of The Handmaid's Tale, in the TV show world, we're in a strangely post-racial moment. And the creator of the show has explained that because in this world, infertility is so high, people just don't care about race anymore. But of course, the show is coded around race, and so June becomes the center, the white woman becomes the center, but she becomes the savior of racialized people. And so her daughter, she's in a biracial relationship, is a black girl, and we see her constantly saving her, as well as many other racialized characters. At the same time, we see her standing up to racialized characters who she thinks has done wrong, and so there's a kind of perverse there's a kind of perverse inversion of who's standing up to whom there, where it becomes the white woman being like the vulnerable one standing up to the problematic racialized woman. So the thing that's interesting to me about The Handmaid's Tale is that you kind of have both. You get to have the sexual slave narrative, and you get to have re-invoke the white sexual slave narrative of the historical figure, along with the white savior figure that we have today. So we have the Offred June. She has two names, the forced name on her, Offred, and her actual name, June. And it also perpetuates a kind of Madonna whore binary because she gets to be the mother. She's one of the few fertile women. She's always making sacrifices and fighting for the children, but she's also the forced whore, forced with a heart of gold. So, I'm almost done. I'm coming to the end here. So I'm just citing here Elizabeth Bernstein's work, who talks about women working to kind of save third world trafficked women who go on these tours in order to kind of see them and then try and save them. And one of the things that Bernstein says is that this sort of activism allows the women who are involved in it to access a sexualized frame, but without compromising their own moral status or social position. So they kind of get to revel in the kind of naughtiness of thinking about brothels and forced sex, but then they can see themselves as the hero. And I really think that The Handmaid's Tale pulls that kind of a move. I feel like the dystopian framework here really allows access to that erotic charge. It has these sort of sumptuous visual spectacles of white slavery. And but at the same time, we get the white savior narrative so that we're protected from knowing that. So whiteness gets to be recentered as both archetypal victim and hero. So like, you know, now you get to have your cake and eat it too, right? You get to be the slave and you get to be the hero. So, okay, back to the sexy outfit. The Halloween outfit that I talked about in the beginning. One of the critiques in the Bustle article that didn't like it said, well, if you want to be sexy for Halloween, fine. Do another kind of sexy outfit. If you want to wear the Handmaid's Tale outfit, fine, but do it as a protester. Don't do it as a sexy thing. Because if you do it as a sexy thing, you're going to be counterproductive to the cause. And so it's like, you know, do it like this. These women are doing it as a protest, as women have been doing it in multiple countries. They don the handmaid outfit to fight against repressive laws around reproduction, etc. So what I want to argue that there's a discourse of an affective overlap between the sexy handmaid Halloween costume and the protest, thinking about the television show as a protest and taking it on as a protest. So, I think A Handmaid's Tale is a form of vicarious kink. So, as I kind of theorize in articles against BDSM, it's a form of role-playing that encourages close identification with the sex slave Offred and the white feminist savior June. And I think there's an erotic pleasure that melds with the satisfaction of the moral superiority and the heroism. So what it does is it does implicitly what the hustler does explicitly, which is it stages the eroticism of the sexuality debates and representations of sexual assault and the repression of sexuality and the evading of that repression. It sort of does all of that but doesn't acknowledge its sexualization. So it disavows it. It disavows the pleasure of it. And therefore the outrage over the sex and handmaid outfits. So, you can have your white savior narrative and your sexual slavery fantasy too. What's wrong with that? Well, I think it supports repressive anti-sexual laws that prevent stigma and puts sex workers' lives and their health at risk. It obscures the human rights and the labor issues for migrant sex workers, and it distracts from unsexy issues like the labor exploitation and marginalization of temporary agricultural workers in Canada. So these, unfortunately, there are no television shows about that kind of oppression that's happening in Ontario, for example. Okay, so let's all put on our sexy handmaid's outfit to expose the erotic investment, sexual slavery, white savior narratives. That is my conclusion.
And then thanks so much for that provocative presentation, but we can also see lots of overlaps and connections to Professor Barsky's presentation with the slippage between the utopia and the dystopia. The glacier, for example, is another slippage. The connections to migration, refugees, various transgressions and things. So we can get towards some of these connections in the discussion, which is going to follow. Now we have Nisa Mali.
I think it's really interesting that everybody wants to dress as a handmaid and nobody's dressing as Martha.
Yes, yes, exactly. It's not that sexy.
No, it's not. So often science fiction imagines technological and scientific advancement and what that advancement makes possible or what it instigates. But it's also been applied to really great effect to imagine alternative economies, labor markets, employment models, community and family structures, social stratification, wealth distribution, political and governance systems. And it does this partially freed from perceived or real limitations such as affordability, scientific feasibility, political viability, social norms, and some like widely accepted stylized facts about our current systems, our markets, and our society. So to quote Ursula K. Le Guin, anything at all can be said to happen in the future without fear of contradiction. The future is a safe, sterile laboratory for trying out ideas in, of games of thinking about reality, method. And I'm going to argue today that the future as a means or a method of thinking about reality holds useful potential for using science fiction to expand the policy imaginary and what we think is possible through policy making. And I'm going to start by talking about 4 ways that science fiction already does play a role in public policy, and then dig into what a policy imaginary is. So I'm going to talk about science fiction writers that work policy day jobs, who work as government advisors, science fiction as a weak signal in strategic foresight, and what some people are calling speculative nonfiction. So most science fiction already engages with political economy in some degree because really fulsome fictional world building demands it. It helps explain the sources and the structures and the relationships of power. It provides the social, economic, and governance scaffolding on which you build your characters and you build your plot. So just looking at a couple of recent publications, The Expanse is a multi-novel series and Amazon TV show that at its heart is about the business of governing an ever-expanding known universe. So dealing with questions of trade, of diplomacy and war, control over scientific innovation, and free movement across borders. And when the books open, there's an industrious scientific colony on Mars, there's company towns in the asteroid belt, and there's a wealthy Earth community with a form of universal basic income. And the book and the shows spend a lot of time exploring what space makes politically, economically, and structurally fragile, and how you defend against this as an individual, as a ship crew, and as a planet. It also looks at how operating at the galactic or the universal level might help erase current differences between nation states and ethnicities. And in the books and in the TV show, we also see a rise of interplanetary racism. At the beginning of the series, our characters are quite marginal to political power. They're workers for a private shipping company, but as the series progresses, they become increasingly central to the political system. They become diplomats, senior advisors, resistance generals, and they lead us into that world and sort of behind those closed political doors. Malka Older's Centennial series is a cyberpunk political thriller. It's set about 20 years after the dismantlement of nation states on Earth and the implementation of a global microdemocracy. And her books explore a highly networked and high-tech future with universal translators, personal flying craft, news drones, the ability to dismantle any guns, sort of like within a radius. But it also deals with the very present-day problem of ensuring democratic elections and governance in an era of increasingly fast global flows of people, money, information, and resources. And in this model of microdemocracy, every 100,000 people is a centennial, and they vote from hundreds of international and local parties and governing corporations. And I'm thinking of what you said about the sort of like interplay between utopias and dystopias, because on first reading this book, I thought, well, this seems like a governance utopia, and on second reading the book, I realized that 7 out of 8 of the top political parties were actually former corporations. To manage the election process and to ensure sort of factual and equal access to information. An international NGO just called Information has come to power. This is sort of like if you took the UN, the World Bank, Google, and Facebook and combined them, operating in a world where cable news has collapsed and funded by public settlements with corporations over misinformation. And the characters in this series include a bunch of political and bureaucratic operatives, including political staffers and politicians, information data analysts, election workers, and anti-democracy activists. Ada Palmer's Terra Ignota series, which starts with Two Legs of Lightning, is set in 2454, 3 centuries after the global church wars, and in a period of robust peace. The nation state's been replaced by a system of hives, which are non-geographic nations that you voluntarily opt into when you reach adulthood, with a sort of series of basic laws that govern everybody, that prevents murder, harming children, and the destruction of natural resources. And the series is really about family dynasties, it's about empire and nepotism, and because there are a bunch of different hives, it explores a range of governing models. So there's a constitutional democracy, there's a hive that's just run with a board of trustees and a suggestion box. There's an absolute monarchy, and there's a corporate shareholder democracy. And then the Hunger Games, to give you a more well-known example, is a authoritarian central government. It's enforced by military suppression and forced labor and surveillance. It is a highly coordinated economic system in which each district specializes in a single industry, and social and economic classes are geographically bounded with no mobility between them unless you fight to the death as a teenager. The second example, science fiction writers who work post day jobs, and this is more common than you think, especially in Ottawa. So Malka Older worked for over a decade in disaster relief management and holds a PhD in the sociology of organizations. Arcady Martin wrote a memoir called Empire as a climate policy advisor for the New Mexican government. And her book's a diplomatic thriller about cultural and military empires and the ways in which we transmit cultural identity and intergenerational memory. Hao Jingfeng, the middle book, is an economic advisor at a state-backed think tank in Beijing. And Folding Beijing, and I think I've got the non-English version up there, imagines that the city of Beijing is divided into 3 classes that have unequal and separate access to the Earth's surface. And sort of every 24 to 12 hours, the whole city folds underground, and everybody that was above ground goes to sleep. And it's a romance between 2 people that are trapped in different classes and are never allowed to share the same social space. And then Thierry Breton is the European Union Commissioner for Internal Markets, a former Harvard business prof, and he's written several science fiction books, including Software, which is actually quite good, and it's about digital espionage. There's also a long history of science fiction writers sort of working outside of governments, but as advisors. So the U.S. Citizens Advisory Council on National Space Policy, which is where this beautiful 1981 report cover came from, has roots in a transition advisory group for the Reagan administration. It was a mixed group of astronauts, computer scientists, space scientists, engineers, and science fiction writers. Sigma, the science fiction think tank, was an advisory group for Homeland Security that actually got revised after 9/11. And to quote the founder, as a professor, he says he formed Sigma because he'd heard more original and appropriate futurism on panels at any given science fiction convention than at all the forecasting meetings he had ever attended in DC. A couple of other examples, the National Defense Canada has hired science fiction writers to dramatize near-future Canadian peacekeeping stories. And most recently, France's Defense Innovation Agency hired a group of science fiction writers to come up with disruptive scenarios that they could then develop military responses to. So this is sort of an active way that governments are engaging science fiction writers. Science fiction was also used as both an input into and an output of strategic foresight. So strategic foresight's an approach to scanning and analysis that imagines probable, possible, and preferable future scenarios, and scenarios plural would be emphasized here. And it's increasingly being used by governments and other organizations, as well as corporations, for medium-term planning. It seeks to envision where contemporary social and economic trends and breakthroughs in science and technology might lead us. And one really common tactic is to cross two potential but unrelated trends and imagine that joint result through scenarios, narratives, and stories. So it sometimes uses science fiction as a kind of weak signal of what might be possible, or what future scenarios we are currently collectively concerned with in the present. But it also is a kind of science fiction itself when done well, particularly when the output is narrative. And these two illustrations are from the end of the 1800s and the early 1900s, and were part of a series imagining life in 2000. And I love these because they predicted essentially audiobooks and Amazon drone delivery. A couple examples of science fiction influencing sort of real-life scientific development, and these are fairly well known. Jules Verne inspired the first US submarines and the modern helicopter. Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 imagined devices that look a lot like earbuds, Bluetooth speakers, flat screen TVs, and ear readers. You might remember he had a news pad where people read the news and read books. And as well, science fiction writers were at the forefront of public discourse on the impacts of the atomic bomb. There's a sort of an interesting story in which the FBI demanded that a science fiction magazine recall its 1944 issue, which included a story about uranium fission, because they were afraid that somebody would get ideas. There's also been a recent wave of science fiction using creative nonfiction in journalism, so effectively speculative writing that uses a nonfiction format. The New York Times op-eds from the future are a really excellent example of this, with headlines like, "Please stop 3D printing unicorns," and "Earth must intervene in space company towns," and these are commissioned mostly by science fiction writers, but also the occasional economist and researcher. A couple of other examples on the side. There's a group in Toronto called Little Data that does workshops in which you write labor manifestos in space, which is an exercise I really love. And there's been a number of outlets and organizations commissioning short stories that explore futuristic nonfiction concepts. So Spacing Magazine, for example, put together an anthology called Toronto 2033, where science fiction writers sort of wrote in a collectively imagined future in the year 2033. Gideon Litchfield, who's a journalist and editor, calls this style doing journalism through science fiction, so taking real-world research about how technology is changing us and how we react to it, and making them into really fully fleshed out stories about imagined futures. And I'd include my own pet project in this bucket. I curate an interview series with conversations between science fiction writers, economists, and labor researchers, and most of the illustrations in this talk are from that series. So we work with illustrators to imagine something from the books that resonates with our research. As researchers who study the near future, we use this series to engage with fictional future scenarios that might have potential for understanding our own futures, as well as to find a more playful entry point into policy debates using the nonfiction interview format. We also do sort of other future-looking, more structured research, including strategic foresight and data modeling, but this is one of the tools we use. And some of the authors we have sort of either published or forthcoming include Malcolm Older, Cory Doctorow, Martha Wells, and Charlie Jane Anders. If you happen to be a science fiction writer and you're in the audience and this is appealing, come talk to me. All right, so the meat of the talk. The current approach, or the approach that's currently in vogue for thinking creatively about policymaking is called policy innovation. Policy innovation has been a sort of decade-long buzzword in government practice, rising out of digital era governance models that reckoned with the digitization of the world and of the bureaucracy, and with new public management's obsession with performance measurement and efficiency. And the title of this slide is a reference to a 2006 article, New Public Management is Dead, Long Live Digital Era Governance. The term policy innovation is often used colloquially to mean coming up with innovative solutions, so programmatic interventions or service design changes that address public policy problems. Sometimes it's referring to a defined field of practice, a sort of toolbox of methodologies that have been declared innovative by the powers that be, by grassroots public servants that have advocated for their use in their own departments, or by other jurisdictions that we in Canada see as cutting edge. And I think the Methodologies tend to be included in this toolbox when they are new, when they're new to governments, or when they're newly technocratized. And sometimes when I think we're doing policy innovation really well, we mean both that the approach and the end results are as innovative as they need to be effective. So that might mean using really boring traditional approaches to come up with really exciting and effective solutions. But because of this blurring between desirable methods and outcomes, policy innovation isn't particularly groundbreaking always. It tends to stay in the realm of tweaking the surfaces of things, so smoothing user experience, without asking why uptake in a program is low, or whether the program is achieving its policy goals. And I'm personally curious, as a former bureaucrat and as somebody that's outside of government, what it would look like to create and implement truly innovative and future-looking policy that sort of collectively imagines the world as we want it to look like, and how we can build it together. So outside of the realm of fiction, an imaginary, to quote Bob Jessup, is a semiotic ensemble that frames individual subjects' lived experiences of an inordinately complex world that guides collective calculation about it. It's a way of understanding the world, it's a meaning system, and it's a package of beliefs, ideas, and material circumstances and processes which together form a perspective on a current institution. Imaginaries as a sort of theoretical concept has its roots in Cornelius Castriadis' term, the social imaginary, but I'm going to quote here from Charles Taylor, writing in 2007, who says that a social imaginary is the way that ordinary people imagine their social surroundings, which is often not expressed in theoretical terms, but is instead carried in images, stories, and legends. So if the social imaginary is the way that people imagine their social existence, their social practices, their social relations, and what's possible and normal between them, the policy imaginary is how policymakers and governments imagine their existence, their practices, their relations, what's possible and normal between them, and what's within their power and control. And much of policy work is already operationalized through speech acts and through written declarations of the future. So speaking points, briefing notes, memorandums to cabinet, economic statements, budgets, UN declarations, trade agreements. And policymaking already regularly engages in imagining the world, imagining the future through text and how to respond to it. But it's usually on the scale of sort of 4-year electoral mandates or multi-year budgets, not this sort of medium and far future and the flexible future that science fiction allows. Traditional political economy is sometimes said to under-explain how subjects and subjectivities are formed, and to neglect or under-explain how things emerge, how they become institutionalized and become modified. While cultural political economy, which is where the concept of the imaginary comes from, is said to be better suited for critically engaging in the social construction of things. So I'm interested in fiction, and in particularly speculative or science fiction, as a tool for expanding the policy imaginary and thinking critically about the stories we tell ourselves about the world, how it came to be, and how it could be. And in using that concept to think about how governments and bureaucrats tell stories about themselves, how they imagine, how they do sense-making of their own institutions and their governance, their roles within them and within society, as well as to draw out how good policymaking requires the ability to imagine a change in the social or economic imaginary status quo, whether that's intervening to change something, to course correct, or to sort of anticipatorily respond to a potential future. And what does this look like in practice? I don't entirely know. I'm hoping we'll do some of that in the roundtable. I don't foresee that science fiction is going to be referenced in briefing notes to senior management. But I think there's something to be said for reading widely and across genres, and Chris sort of alluded to this in his opening remarks. And I think that the policymaking needs to find ways to think more creatively, and to expand both present day and future conceptions of what's possible and desirable, and to shift themselves out of policy ruts and binary debates so that we're asking more interesting questions about the world. So, for example, a standard binary policy debate, would ask, like, should we lower student loan interest rates? A more interesting question might be, like, what is the most effective and best way that we could fund post-secondary education? And what does our education system need to look like in the year 2040 or 2140 to actually respond to the social, economic, and climate trends that we hypothesize might be coming? And so I'm going to sort of leave it at that. But while I'm standing here and while I'm on a campus, I should mention that the think tank that I work for is currently hiring summer interns. So if there's students in the room that want to do a sixth, then I'm happy to chat about this afterwards, and those are 2 paid internships. And that's it.